This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, researchers, scholars, or simply people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. I am now joined by Professor Sander Gilman, who teaches history at Emory University in the United States. He's an extremely prolific academic with a vast spectrum of fields of expertise, and he is now in Israel to present his most recent study, which is cleverly entitled Aliens versus Predators, Cosmopolitan Jews versus Jewish Nomads. Hello, Professor Gilman, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with a semantic question. What is really the difference between nomads and cosmopolitans? I'm assuming it's mainly value judgment, because it's better to be a cosmopolitan than a nomad, the same way it's better to be an expat than an immigrant.
Absolutely true. What I'm interested in is how these two terms, starting in the 18th century, take on certain qualities, right? And cosmopolitanism becomes one of the more positive concepts of the 18th century. The French Enlightenment loves cosmopolitans. They love the notion of people who live beyond the borders of the national state, who are not bound by its rules, who are citizens of the world. And that word appears over and over again. But the 18th century is also obsessed by nomads. Mm-hmm. Every thinker who writes about cosmopolitan always writes about nomads, and those concepts wind up being linked in ways that sometimes the cosmopolitans are good and sometimes they're bad. Sometimes the nomads are noble and sometimes they're pathetic. And what interests me is that the touchstone for almost every one of these conversations, from 1706 to 2015, wind up being this odd group of cosmopolitans and or nomads called the Jews.
Mm-hmm. But before we get to the Jews, I'd like to ask you another question about cosmopolitanism. Why is it so central to modern 18th century thinking? You mentioned the Enlightenment.
Well, because the major thinkers of the Enlightenment, certainly in France, but also in Germany, and I'm going to add in England and Scotland, are people who in complicated ways feel themselves oppressed by national states. Voltaire has to flee across the border to Switzerland. So in other words, it isn't that it's objective, it's self-serving. They see themselves as citizens of the world. When Rousseau writes, and when Locke writes, and when Lessing writes, they see themselves as transcending political borders. Of course, they don't. But they imagine a world where the cosmopolitan, who's almost always a member of some elite.
Precisely because the movement of populations in this time, when transport was really limited, was the privilege of the top tier of the elite, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And one of the things that interests me in the 18th century is that the image that appears over and over and over again are people in coaches, people who can afford to buy a ticket or buy a coach, like Moses Montefiore, right, and ride through Europe. In the 19th century, by the way, the coach becomes replaced by the railway train. And there we get more mass movement, but it's absolutely the case that we're not talking here about the movements of people because of famine. We're not talking about the movement of people because of war. Those people would not have been understood as cosmopolitans. They would have been understood as refugees, right? The cosmopolitan is the person who can afford to be a cosmopolitan.
And what about nomads?
Well, the nomad is an interesting category because the nomad, all of these writers write about nomads, and the nomads are kind of in the historical past. Yeah, they're also interested in some nomads in Siberia, and they're interested in some nomads in the Middle East in the 18th and 19th century. But for them, the question is, at what point do people become rooted? For all of these people, the nomad predates agriculture, predates cities. They've all read their Bible, and it's Abraham coming before Isaac and Jacob, becoming the nomad who then eventually becomes the city dweller. And so on the one hand, the cosmopolitan is someone who crosses borders as a member of an elite. On the other hand, the nomad is that person who, in ancient times, wandered around the desert and then becomes rooted. So again, cosmopolitanism versus rootlessness.
So when did it start to become a pejorative thing to be a migrant, which is something that is so evident in the 20th and even 21st century?
Well, that's why this is, for me, such an absolutely interesting undertaking, because when one starts to ask that question, one realizes that built into both of these concepts from their origin in the early 18th century is both the positive and the negative. In other words, it isn't that cosmopolitans are good and nomads are bad. Sometimes cosmopolitans, because they have no real roots, are seen as being very negative.
Like in the Soviet Union, for example.
Like in the Soviet Union, absolutely. I mean, when Stalin talks about rootless cosmopolitan, that is a long history, absolutely a long history. Nomads, on the other hand, wind up being, in some thinkers, Herder, for example, in a way pure. In other words, they start to go downhill when they build cities, right? So what's interesting to me is these two concepts are, can we say, a kind of a poison chalice, because if you become one or the other, you're also maybe the opposite. And what's the real question I have in the book is what happens when there is a group that is perceived as inherently cosmopolitan. Here we come to the Jews, or because of the fact that everybody reads the Bible. They may not like the Bible, like Voltaire, but everybody reads the Bible. Everybody knows the Bible stories. Whether or not then the nomadic, wanderer is as a positive force, Abraham, or is a negative force. And then we get this very odd struggle around what it means to be rooted and unrooted, to be mobile and not to be mobile. And it's almost always, and let me stress this, and you talked about refugees, it's almost always a question not of those people who have to move, but those people who want to move.
You talked about the Enlightenment and the citizens of the world, but on the other hand, of course, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's the movement of romantic nationalism. You mentioned Herder in passing.
Yeah.
How did the concept of cosmopolitanism fit into this?
Well, this is where the great struggle is. The great struggle is in the course of the, can we say, post-French Revolutionary moment. The question is, how do you constitute a national state out of idealized cosmopolitans? It's very hard to do that. By definition, the cosmopolitan was created to answer the boundaries of the national state. So what happens is you get things like, this wonderful phrase, local cosmopolitans. That is, people who are rooted in a space, this is Herder's notion, but who also can move through the world, right? They kind of have the best of both. The difficulty is that in constituting national states, and remember the 19th century is the age of the invention of the national states out of imagined communities. France is the only country that we can think of in Europe that is a homogeneous national state. Britain becomes, in the 18th century, the United Kingdom, right? England becomes the United Kingdom. Germany exists only at the end of that century. Italy exists only at the end of that century. Switzerland has a longer history, but I don't want to go through every country in Europe. But the whole point is, for those countries, you need to have rootedness. And then the question is, well, how can you be cosmopolitan and be rooted? And out of that, of course, comes the other great ideological movements of the late 19th and early 20th century, which are communism and Zionism, both of which emphasize rootedness, but also a type of cosmopolitanism, right? Stalin doesn't like the cosmopolitan, but the argument is that the Marxists are the citizens of the world.
Yeah, it's a universal calling.
It's a universal calling.
Yeah.
And Zionism, on the other hand, is when it begins, Herzl's fantasy about Palestine is that all of the people in Palestine will speak the languages of their home country. The French will come to Palestine and speak French, and the Germans will speak German, and the Spaniards will speak Spanish, except, of course, for the Eastern Jews, because Yiddish is not a real language, right? Yeah. In other words, his fantasy about Palestine is a rooted nationalism, which is cosmopolitan. And his model, obviously, is Switzerland. He says this, right? His model is Switzerland. The early Zionists are appalled by this. There's the big struggle. What do we speak, Yiddish or do we speak Hebrew? Because you have to have, we're back to Herder, a national language that is the language of a national territory. And then this real question as well, early Zionists fight against the cosmopolitan. They don't like cosmopolitanism. And this is, of course, part of the great struggle, and not only among Zionists and among Soviet communists, about this citizen of the world versus citizen of the state, but also what does it mean then to exist beyond the national state?
Yeah, and if we tackle the two European models that we talked about, and it creates another tension or perhaps duality when it comes to the Jews, because on the one hand, there are perhaps the textbook example of a cosmopolitan with a rooted potential for rootedness, right. And on the other hand, there's still this is the period where anti-Semitism becomes rampant.
Yeah, and one of the charges, and that's why nomadism is so fascinating to me. The theologians and the philosophers of the 18th and early 19th century debate nomadism as a quality of the past. Once you get after the 1870s and 1880s, all of a sudden people are writing anti-Semitic tractates, big books, about the Jews in the present world as nomads. In other words, nomadism becomes one of the labels, pejorative labels, for Jewish cosmopolitans at the end of the 19th century. There are people without a land, right? By the way, the one person who argues against this, which is very interesting, is Adolf Hitler. He says nomads are perfectly good. They do have a territory. The Jews don't even have a territory, right? This is the great joke, which is Hitler argues against Jewish nomadism because he thinks that even the nomads are better than the Jews, right? But no, it's a huge, huge problem in the debates within fascism, because not only does nomadism then take on purely a pejorative meaning, but so does cosmopolitanism. The Nazis hate the cosmopolitans because the cosmopolitans are for them the communists, and the communists are the Jews. This is what we can call a sliding scale of terminology, right? So cosmopolitans becomes one of the buzzwords against which Goebbels preaches all the time, because they can't be rooted, right? They can't be rooted.
And if we go to the Soviet Union and to communism, there's another problem with the cosmopolitanism, especially in this period, and when it comes to the Jews, that it's always there's some sort of connection to commerce and capital and money.
From the very beginning, when Herder talks about the nomads, one of the things that Herder says about the nomads is that they invented capitalism, right? And there's a big debate starting with Georg Simmel and his book on the philosophy of money in 1906, 1907, going through to Max Weber in the 1920s about the relationship of Jews to commerce, but always via this debate about the Jews as nomads. It's very interesting. And that becomes, it's just part of the standard trope of anti-Semitism, which is the Jews are a people of money, but they're also the people who invented it. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, Weber dismisses this because, of course, he had made the argument at the end of the 19th century that capitalism grows out of Protestantism, right? Which probably wasn't right either. But this is a really important debate in the period from the middle of the 19th century. I'm going to make an argument up through certainly the post-World War II period.
Mm-hmm. That?
Oh yeah, that the cosmopolitan / nomadic Jews are, in point of fact, the exploiters of capitalism, right? And that they bear this kind of stigma. And if you're of the left, you hate them because they're capitalists. And if you are of the right, you hate them because they're Jews. Mm-hmm. It's a very easy kind of, and by the way, those two categories bleed, right? Mm-hmm. So the left is very unhappy with their Jewishness, and the right with that kind of capitalism that they fantasize that the Jews represent.
Yeah. And if we go forward in time to the post-war period, the latter half of the 20th century, even the 21st century, where cosmopolitanism is technically possible, a lot more than it used to be. I mean, there are people moving around the globe, left, right, and center, taking a lot of capital with them, but that's a different story. What are the lessons that your historical exploration can teach us about today's cosmopolitanism, in particular about the Jews?
Well, it's an interesting question because after the Second World War, this model of cosmopolitanism, which is very fraught, becomes a kind of positive quality. It becomes one way of thinking about the United Nations, one way of thinking about all of us as citizens of the world. It's still the elites because, again, the cosmopolitan is by definition somebody who can afford to go abroad, while the refugee is forced to go on a raft across the Mediterranean. So that distinction is always made. But what is also becomes very, very problematic is that the nation state after the Second World War becomes ever more important. So this notion of a local cosmopolitanism, and I'm going to make an argument in the book that, in a sense, the Israelis struggle with this more than any other national group. When the Prime Minister spoke a few weeks ago after the horrors in Paris, saying that all Jews should come to Israel.
Should come home.
Should come home to Israel. Thank you for the correction.
Yeah.
Absolutely come home to Israel. What he's expressing is a standard Zionist trope. The difficulty is the Jews that he is addressing are now heavily Israelis in Paris, in Berlin, in Bangkok, in Shanghai. And one of the things that fascinates me is that we live in a global age. My son moved in January with his family and my grandchildren from New York to Bangkok, right?
You don't resent him for that?
I resent him deeply for that. But that's the way of the world. I mean, his generation is indeed global and rooted. He feels no guilt about that, as Americans feel at home in the world because they've been trying to take it over for 100 years. But Israelis feel a kind of sense of depression. I mean, it's the only collective that not only has a positive term for rootedness, which is aliyah, but it also has a negative term for not being rooted, which is yerida. And so one of the things that one is very interested in is how the cultural elite in Israel that is now a global Israeli elite deals with someone like Bibi Netanyahu, raised in the United States. His father was my colleague at Cornell for 25 years. Raised in the United States, as were his two brothers, who make Aliyah, right? Make Aliyah, and who are, he thought, I suspect, addressing French Jews. But if you go to Paris, you meet an awful lot of young Israelis, right? So that's why this is an interesting issue of 2015 for me, as well as an interesting issue of 1710.
And I'm sure that it is for our listeners too. So Professor Sandra Gilman of Emory University, thank you very much for this interview.
I thank you.
This brings us to the end of our show. Thank you very much for listening. I am Gilad Halpern, signing off now in Tel Aviv. I'd like to thank my technical producers, Adam Scher and Alex Benish. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.